Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of the Mac Gamecast, a podcast where we talk about Mac games, more Mac games, and possibly other games with Mac in them, and related things. With me is Sam. How you doing, Sam?
I'm doing well, thank you.
And Casper, how are you?
Hi there, I'm doing well as well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you guys for being here yet again. Our last episode was a lot of fun. And for round 2, I'm going to try and talk a little less. Also, I realized editing the first podcast, I'm just running my mouth for most of it. So I'm going to try and throw you guys some more questions because I really like hearing what you have to say. So today's quick upfront is we're going to talk about the Steamdeck in terms of news and how that relates. Some games we're playing, if any. I forgot to do that last time. And then we're going to talk about gamer preferences, identity platforms, stuff like that. So, Casper, would you mind telling us about the Steamdeck?
Sure. So Valve have announced a new hardware console kind of thing. It's sort of like a handheld mini PC of sorts with a Ryzen processor using the second generation Zen architecture and an RDNA 2 GPU. As an APU package, so all on one chip, like you would find in most consoles. It's sort of like form factor-wise similar to a Nintendo Switch, but running PC games through Steam, of course. And it'll run a variation of Linux based on Arch with the SteamOS branding. So all the Steam games you're familiar with that run on Linux will run natively, of course. And like Valve has for their Linux operating system platforms, it'll also be able to use their Proton. Mac gamers will know of, or maybe know of Wine and Crossover, and Proton is sort of a similar technology there, forked from Wine, to let it run Windows titles as well. Some more or less officially supported and some more experimentally, but in my experience that runs pretty well using Proton, various games. So that's certainly the news there. And interesting from a Mac platform perspective is that most titles available for Linux, I find, are also available for Mac OS. So I think that more interest in the Linux community for developers will also inspire more Mac games. But that's just my take on it.
What about you, Sam? What's your take on the Steamdeck announcement?
Yeah, it's super interesting. From a power standpoint, it's a lot more powerful than a Switch, but it's not rivaling current consoles or anything. I think it's hard to compare cross generation, but it's around the same power as a base PS4 or Xbox One, which was released in 2013.
Okay, cool.
So,
I was going to ask about the comparison to Switch, so I'm glad you mentioned that.
So yeah, it's quite a bit faster than the Switch, maybe double the power, but powers, I don't know, it's hard to quantify really power because you have Witcher 3 running on a Switch, which
yeah,
I don't know, it just depends how much the devs want to optimize and stuff.
Right.
But more power is always nice. So super interesting. It runs Proton. Proton, like Casper was saying, will emulate a lot of stuff. It does have a pretty big asterisk of certain genres. Particularly genres I like to play, like competitive multiplayer games, don't really work. And that's mostly due to anti-cheat programs. Third-party anti-cheats don't work with the emulator. They just think you're cheating or you're hacking or something.
I see, right.
Completely block you from playing the game. But in general, a lot of games do work. Some of them even work close to native or even better than native performance on Windows. So
Interesting. Yeah, what I was curious about, I'm not a mobile gamer. I mean, I own a couple iOS games. We'll get more into that later, I guess. I don't know. I own all of 2 or 3 I bought on sale several years ago. But what you just mentioned, Witcher 3 is available on Switch. I think Doom Eternal was also put over. And of course, from an average PC standpoint, that's considered, or maybe a higher end console, it's considered, a big AAA, fast-paced, demanding game. And most people pride themselves, some people at least pride themselves on running it on their high-end PC or in boot camp or something on a higher end Mac. And it all being big and bombastic on a screen, and maybe you got speakers or surround sound or something, but then you condense it into this little mobile experience. this relates a little bit to our main topic later, but I always wondered, like, how much, so as someone who hasn't actually played on a Switch, actually, that's not true. I tried it at PAX East in Boston, I think in 2018, but I was trying some weird, like, zombie game in the woods, and I couldn't really figure out the controls, so I gave up. But, like, can you really get the same experience on something like a Switch or a Steam Deck as you would on a regular PC or Mac? You know, what do you guys think?
I mean, so one factor is that on a smaller screen, you'll need to push less pixels to get the same feeling of visual fidelity, right? So they don't necessarily need comparative performance levels, right?
That's true.
And you'll also notice it less if there's less detail in the textures and things like that because the screen is smaller. But I'm not even convinced that you need this, or that the goal is to get the same experience necessarily. Because if let's say your goal is to have a gaming experience that you can take with you on vacation, if you're just going somewhere with your family and want a few hours off in the evening, or you want something to play on the train or something, and you are the kind of person who prefers bigger, proper games or whatever you want to call it, right? Then you have a way of taking that with you, even if you then also want a bigger setup at home to play at ultra resolution, higher settings and stuff. And for that, there's a place in the market for something like a Steam Deck maybe, or a Switch with some games, right?
Right. It says, go ahead, Sam.
Oh, I was gonna say, like, so I've been like trying to get into mobile gaming for a long time. Or not by mobile gaming, I mean like the Switch, and before that the Vita. I own a Switch. I own a bunch of games on it, and it's a really cool form factor that is really, really good in a handheld mode and really, really bad on a TV. And by really bad, I mean like I have a 4K TV. I'm not expecting it to run at 4K, but a lot of people might have experience trying to run like the old N64 or something on your HD TV, and it just looks off. You kind of get the same thing with a lot of Switch games where they're maybe running at 540p or 720, and because they're upscaled so much, it just is like, what am I looking at here?
Right.
So I would rather undock it and play on the couch or in bed or whatever, which is a totally great experience. So I'm expecting it'll be similar for the Steam Deck. I wouldn't buy one expecting to like sell your gaming PC or your desktop or laptop or whatever. But if you want a great mobile experience, it definitely has the specs to be really great for a mobile platform.
Right. Yeah.
I think,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think they mostly try to target 720p as the resolution for running games and stuff. So yeah,
it's not
probably not the greatest on a 4K massive screen, but it should be great for handheld.
I'm glad you brought that up because I was specifically going to ask, looking at the Steam Deck page, which of course is store.steampower.com/Steam Deck for anyone wondering. And at the bottom, there's a dock too, and connect to external displays, wired networking, USB peripherals, and power. You can also use a powered USB-C hub if you've got one lying around. The official dock will be sold separately. More information coming soon. So I am curious how many people either use it that way or even expect to use it that way. It isn't its primary function. The primary function is mobile gaming, like you guys were just talking about, maybe on a train or vacation or here and there. In terms of form factor compared to something like a Switch, how does the Steam Deck compare? Or maybe even like an iPad? What do you guys think?
So screen size, I think it's identical to the new Switch, the OLED model that just came out, 7-inch screen. I think the major difference between the two, other than power, is the Steam Deck weighs about twice as much, which it has a little more comfortable, like curved grips and a little bit better, like controller, so to speak. So
I did like those curved grips. I'm on the page now. That was a weird gesture. Yeah. But it seems to have buttons underneath as well, where like if your hands were resting on it, some triggers here and maybe up here. So it has more, I guess, controls than I thought it did at a glance.
Yeah, I think it's I think it's almost exactly double the weight. So just something to keep in mind if you like to play in bed or something. It's probably
Right.
super
Yeah,
heavy. After
do
about
people
2
do that?
minutes.
Like lay in bed and hold it above them?
Probably.
And like,
I've tried it.
arm workout.
So when you're reading a big hardcover book, laying in bed.
Right. That's true. I do read a lot in bed, so I can see that. So what's curious here, not curious, interesting is it comes in 3 versions, the Steam Deck, or 3 variations perhaps. $400 gets you 64 GB, an eMMC hard drive. $529, this is all USD. $529 gets you a 256, but an NVMe SSD. So those are way faster, like significantly faster. I think it's double or triple the read rate or write speed or whatever. I guess it depends on what NVMe version they have. I think there's versions 2 through 4 or something. In any case, it's a lot faster. And then at $649, the lack of round numbers is annoying me here. Instead of like $650, it gets you a 512 GB with the same NVMe SSD. Oh, interesting. Okay, if you're looking at the highest end model, it's also saying premium anti-glare etched glass. And yeah, interesting. So it's changing the glass. It reminds me of, I don't know, they were offering this on certain Macs or Mac Pros or whatever, or I guess that display you can buy for like $5,000, some like anti-glare thing. That was a matte display though, I think.
Yeah, that was for the iMac. They offered it also for the Pro Display XDR, but it was on the iMacs as well.
I never tried it, but I think I might have seen it in an Apple store. I don't recall. Interesting. So let's talk about what games. I should have done a little more research before I hopped on here of what Linux games also have Mac versions that might be a good fit for this. I mean, a few are easy to say. Something like Hades, I believe, would be like a really ideal fit for this. I think that's an interesting game. Anyway, never mind like the Steam Deck or Switch or something, though it's available there. I think, Sam, you were saying, or Casper, when you said, I think last episode, it had cross-platform saves, I believe. That's really cool. Cross-platform stuff really should be the future. That's a little bit of a different discussion, but it's cool. But you can see in the there's a rotating GIF, whatever, on the Steam Deck page, and it's showing Hades. I think it's showing Transistor, so we have a few Supergiant games in there. Showing Dead Cells. I think these particular sort of top-down roguelite action games are perfect for mobile gaming and also good on a PC. Like, they're a really nice hybrid. It looks like they're showing a flight game here and some sort of shooter as well. I can't speak to those because I'm not clear what games they are offhand or how well. Again, like when I imagine mobile, like if I were to buy a Steam Deck, unlikely, but maybe someday I will, especially if I'm traveling a bunch or something. I would think to get something like a Hades style game or Dead Cells. I happen to own both of those on Mac and I played them a bunch. They're really fun. Excuse me. But like, yeah, would I try and play a Witcher 3 or a Doom Eternal on a Switch or a Steam Deck? I don't know. I don't know if I'd bother trying because I guess this is our segue into the main topic. Like gamer identities and preferences is, I don't think, even if I could, I don't think I would, because I'm a little fussy. I want that bigger screen experience with nice sound and or speakers or surround sound or whatever. And I always buy a 27-inch iMac if I can. I have one right now, so I'm looking for that like bigger scale experience, especially for shooters or maybe certain strategy games, or maybe some game that's more cinematic or something like that. It's almost like a theater experience in comparison. If you're talking about like a Switch or Steam Deck in comparison to like a 20 or 30-inch computer screen. So I don't think I'd ever try. And the Steam Deck itself says it has more than enough performance to run the latest AAA games in a very efficient power envelope. Your Steam library anywhere, you just log into your Steam Deck and your whole Steam library shows up like any other PC. It's built for extended play sessions, apparently, whether using thumbsticks or trackpads. So they are really marketing this to be like a full-fledged gaming on the go type experience. I don't know if Switch markets itself the same, or it kind of leans more into the some more of a slim down experience. You guys might be able to speak to that. It's interesting,
it's
though.
Nintendo, right? So they mostly live on their own games, I think, like Splatoon and Mario games and stuff.
Right, that's true. And of course, as we were discussing earlier, I think we were, there are a lot of Mac versions of Linux games. Not every single one, but a lot of them. Every now and then I'm fooled by the Steam Play logo on Steam when it's just Windows and Linux. I'm like, oh, it has a Mac version. I'm like, oh, oops, it doesn't. That doesn't happen that often, but it does occasionally. But it would be neat that there's probably quite a few games that would work on here. Or of course, you can always just buy the game anyway, Mac version or not, and play it on the Switch or the Steam Deck. Or maybe you already do some gaming in Boot Camp, which I used to do a lot of. In fact, one of the first things I used to do when I got a new Mac was install Boot Camp. Go through the registration screen, blah, 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 set up username and everything. And then I would just go and install Boot Camp right away. Not because I exclusively gamed on Boot Camp. I did a ton of Mac gaming too. It was just certain games I wanted to play were only available on PC, and that's part of our existential Mac gaming problem. There's a ton of great games on Mac, but there's also a ton of great games not on Mac. So what are you happy with? And we have all these, as we discussed a bit on the last podcast, if anyone listened to that, presumably you would have, we ended with talking about how Apple was themselves even talking about, we kind of like the idea of this challenge of putting out a higher end GPU for more intensive games. So maybe more, those bigger games will become available on Mac in the future, or more consistently at least. But for now, I don't know, I have things in my backlog I'm waiting to play, I don't know, Halo 4 from the Master Chief Collection, Dishonored 2 I never quite finished, Witcher 3 I didn't quite finish, stuff like this, where it's it's not that I don't have enough games otherwise to play, because there are thousands and thousands of games available on Mac. It's just what level are you happy at? Are you happy with the Apple Arcade level, where everything's basically some sort of hybrid or scaled up iOS game because it has to run on all the iOS and iPad and everything too? Or, are you happy with just sort of casual or free to play games? Or are you into the more hardcore type stuff? I think those designations of casual and hardcore are a little too, what do you call it? They aren't accommodating enough in the gaming space. I like the board game terms a little better. They tend to use light, medium, and heavy, which I think is a better gradation. I would call myself a medium heavy gamer on average. Not exclusively one or the other, but somewhere in that range. I tend to avoid lighter games, but not always. So that's where I am about that. If you guys, let's say, start with Casper, where do you see yourself getting a Steam Deck ever? And if so, what kind of games might you look to play on it?
Realistically, probably not. There is a part of me that kind of wants one, just because I like the idea of playing on the go, and I always like tinkering with new hardware. But I probably would not really use it very much, because when I am at home, I'd just be playing on my iMac, and when I'm on the go, I typically have my laptop with me anyway also. And I don't really see myself pulling out a handheld device for any quote-unquote real games. So no, I don't think I'd be interested in getting a Switch realistically. But as I said, I also do just like tinkering with hardware, and I did wind up buying a DualSense PlayStation 5 controller just to try and tinker with it and see if I can make the lights glow or the triggers work funnily or something like that.
Nice.
Maybe just to tinker, but not really for games, I think.
Yeah, I'd also I think approach it from a curiosity perspective more than anything. But Sam, how about you? What are you feeling here?
I was so close to ordering one, but I know I wouldn't actually use. I love buying every tech thing, so that was my main reason for buying it. And the one thing I really like about the Steam Deck over something like the Switch is I've been very frustrated with the Switch from a standpoint of it doesn't do anything other than play mostly just Nintendo games. And by doing anything, I'm not talking about like some crazy like running around Linux or something on it, officially sanctioned, but like Netflix or like Prime Video, or it has a YouTube app. And I think the YouTube app is the only third-party app on the Switch. So it's if it had a little bit more sort of like media entertainment, you could take it places and you could be like, okay, I don't want a game right now, but I'm going to watch a show or I'm going to do whatever. And it also doesn't support Bluetooth headphones. So you can't use like your AirPods or whatever. You have to buy a little Bluetooth dongle. So Nintendo does a bunch of little things. They try to get a little nickel and dime a little bit. And I respect that they're trying to, let's just do one thing really well. Let's just have gaming on the go and let's only do that. But like all the other consoles, they have like Twitch and YouTube, or Switch has YouTube, but Netflix, Prime Video, Apple TV Plus,
right. Yeah.
All those other stuff. And then the other thing I like about the Steam Deck, sort of on the same topic, because it's running Linux, you can do whatever you want. You could put a full browser on there. You could wipe it and install Windows if you wanted to. Like Valve has officially said that. A lot more freedom, and with that dock, it wouldn't be a great desktop gaming experience, but you could have like Open Office on there and do your productivity work while the Steam Deck is docked.
Yeah, it's a multi-purpose entertainment / potential productivity platform. Yeah, Casper, what do you think?
Yeah, while it can do all those things, I'm thinking about the difference between being able to do something and something being able to do it well, right? Because while you might be able to just use a browser to go to Netflix or write documents in OpenOffice, right, or whatever you want, is it going to be an experience that will make you want to do that if it's just the desktop version of these programs that's running on a tiny little display with thumbsticks?
Right. I think that's it's a really good question. Like Sam just said, not great. And it surprises me as someone who is biased against mobile experiences. Like I said, I'm looking for something more medium heavy, or something with a keyboard and mouse control. I like to play a lot of strategy games as well. Like, I don't know, how are you going to play like StarCraft or Warhammer or Civ on a tiny little screen, right? I guess Civilization's turn-based, that works, but real-time strategy games on like a small screen it's why they don't really work on consoles either, for the same reason. Traditionally, I know they've occasionally made a few Halo Wars, and I don't even know what else. They did, I think, a voice-controlled Tom Clancy one back in the day. I forget what it was called. But that was their solution. They didn't have enough of a physical input device, so they were relying on voice commands to make it work. I forget what it was called. It was a Tom Clancy game anyway.
End War was the name.
Yes, thank you. So as someone who has a love of that from growing up, starting with Warcraft 1 and all the Command and Conquers and StarCrafts, and Farrell did a great job on like the Warhammer Dawn of War series, the 2 and the 3, and I don't know what RTS I played lately, some indie ones, yeah.
One thing I wanted to mention is that Valve, I haven't had any experience with these, but they do have their Steam controller trackpad things, which are supposed to be a lot better than a normal controller for what you're talking about, RTS and stuff. Obviously not really rivaling a full keyboard and mouse.
Right.
It has the dual touchpads, which are like basically like a 1 or 2 inch trackpad.
Right.
Which give you that sort of finer control.
That would definitely help. I had a friend who I've now fallen out of touch with, sadly. Thomas, used to talk to him for a long time back on instant message. I think, what did we talk on? AIM even or something. Hilarious. But he was a real technical guy as well, mostly with audio. He was like an audio fanatic, like obsessed with getting surround sound to work and everything in weird ways. He would even go so far as to inject like files into his game somehow to make them surround sound even when they weren't. He would like do all this deep dive stuff. I even tried it once with Killing Floor and it worked, even on Mac. That was interesting. Of course, you have to have either speakers or headset capable of surround sound. But why was I talking about him? Right, because he had one of those Steam controllers with the pads, and he would talk to me about it often. I never got one myself. I could see how he said there was a bit of a learning curve, but once you did, it was very good and superior for him at least, to like an Xbox controller or a PS controller. I have limited experience with both. That would be better. So once again, I think this relates to what kind of gamer are you? There's definitely people who I think kind of exclusively live in certain gaming spaces. Like all they play is strategy or war games. All they play is shooters. There's a little less room for that on the Mac in terms of shooters these days for reasons we discussed last episode. And it's like, what's a great competitive shooter game on the Mac right now? And it's kind of like CSGO, I guess. It's kind of hard to recommend anything else. Where of course on the PC side, people are playing Warzone and Destiny 2 and I don't know, all kinds of stuff. But like those are a few obvious big names. Rainbow Six Siege, is another big one and stuff like that. We still do have competitive action games in the space, as we discussed. Things like Rust or Unturned, or there's tons of, pretty much all the MOBAs are available on Mac, Dota and League of Legends and all this stuff. Though I don't know if League runs on 64-bit, or I heard maybe there's an issue where I think it doesn't run on M1. I don't know. I don't play the game specifically. Or are you, what level of gamer are you? Where do you exist? Are you more of like an indie gamer? There's tons of indie games on Mac. Most of them are available on Mac, which is cool. Or are you a gamer who plays a bit of everything, including the full Mac spectrum, dabbling in, Boot Camp or Windows, or a mobile game or a Switch or whatever? I'm mostly in that category of a bit of everything. I tend to really like RPGs and shooters and strategy, but I occasionally dip into a roguelike or a card game, or something like that, or just some random indie adventure game or something. But I do shy away from mobile stuff, and it's also why I've shied away from Apple Arcade. I keep looking at it. Shout out to Mr. Macwright, who does a lot of content on this on his YouTube. And I think there's definitely an audience for that. And they are adding to the service. It is growing. My brother uses it, actually. And this is where I think it's good. He doesn't use it for himself. He uses it because he has 2 kids. And he doesn't just throw a device at him and go, here, play whatever you want. He's actually a teacher, and he's into pedagogics and all this stuff in terms of like how children learn and process information. And this is touching on a topic we actually want to discuss next podcast a little bit in terms of like gaming and connections with people and stuff. But I forget what the name of it is. He likes to play this game where it's like an adventure RPG. It's got, colorful cartoony graphics, and there's a cat and a dog, and you can switch between them as the characters. And one of them's like the melee, one of them's like the ranged. I think you can even play it co-op with a little controller. So he has 2 kids aged like 13 and 9, I believe. So he's starting to introduce them to some gaming stuff because he recognizes where, just where the world's going in terms of tech and digital. He doesn't want them to be hooked on it and addicted, but he doesn't want them to be ignorant of it either. So he's introducing it to them in what he feels is a responsible way. But he likes it because you've got to make some decision making in the game. You have to have some awareness of like enemies. You have to change out your gear. You may have to use one character, like the dog or something is better against some characters than the cat, and vice versa. So you have to make some decision making and some critical thinking. And so he's thinking of it from that perspective. So I don't have kids, but if I did, I think Apple Arcade could be a really good tool for that. It's fairly cheap, and you get a big library of games. If you're the kind of gamer who also enjoyed them, well, that would just be a bonus, because then you get to play them too. I'm the kind of guy who I look at Apple Arcade and go, I would literally never, ever play any of these games, like, willingly. I would never go out of my way to play them, because they just fall into that sort of light category, at least from what I can tell, that I just don't enjoy. Doesn't mean they're bad games, it just means they're games not for me, which is an important distinction. I don't think the service is bad, I don't think mobile gaming's bad, or Switch, or console, or anything. I just don't enjoy them, so I don't play them. Like, so why would I? So that's where I stand on that, basically. And I think, when I was younger, I was much less mature about it, and I was just a console hater and a PC hater and a mobile hater and all this stuff. I've learned to grow a bit wiser, hopefully, anyway, and be like, yeah, make that important distinction. It's not that it's bad, it's just it's not for me, and it's for tons of other people. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, Apple's App Store is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, like, gaming revenue in the world. I forget the billions they make, but it's, like, bigger than Steam and Epic and whatever, all those other things, Xbox, live or whatever the store is. So that's really interesting. Where do you guys stand on sort of that spectrum yourself, or any thoughts on that? Sam, starting with Sam.
Yeah. So mobile gaming, I have my one guilty pleasure on my iPhone, which is Clash Royale. It's the one mobile game I play. In general, I don't care at all for mobile games. I will never look to the App Store and look for them. And I dislike it when like big like marketing firms or like Apple even, for example, tries to claim that like we have the most popular gaming platform or something, because it's like, well, sure, but like Clash of Clans or whatever mobile game isn't really in the same ballpark as like Call of Duty or I don't know, whatever AAA game. Like it's kind of like comparing like a Hollywood movie to like YouTube. It's just totally different. They're both video, but they're not comparable really at all. So I have one guilty pleasure, and then for a long time I thought I was the kind of guy who needed the and I still have it, the spec'd out PC with my million hertz monitor and my perfect fidelity and all that stuff. And it's nice. I'm not gonna like say that stuff's not nice, but one thing I've noticed recently is I've been playing around a lot with on my laptop and on my Switch and with some of the cloud streaming platforms. And I've noticed when I'm playing a game that's good, I forget that I'm playing it on the inferior experience, so to speak. And by inferior, I just mean like the frame rate's lower, the graphics are medium instead of ultra or something. Like it was Metro Exodus, which is like the new sort of like, they just had a brand new like ray tracing version of the game released. I was trying it on my PC, everything's turned up, looks great. I was playing it for like 30 minutes, and then I was playing it on my laptop through some cloud streaming, and I played it for like 4 hours, and I forgot that it was worse on the laptop. It was just like, is the game good or is it not? Was really the important thing. And I find like those little sort of like, I used to care so much about graphics, and now I've realized that I find graphics, they'll entice me for the first 10, 15, 20 minutes of the game. And if the game's not good by that point, I just won't ever play it again. Or if it is good, I'll keep playing it and not really care about the graphics. So yeah.
Nice. Sam, sorry, Casper, what are you feeling and thinking here?
Well, in a lot of ways, I think I'm similar to both of you, in that my preference is skewed towards bigger titles, the AAA space, and well, not necessarily AAA. I also enjoy indie titles, but not the mobile sphere. But I also think that we can sort of cut the mobile sphere into two separate large categories as well. I see them as like games that want you to jump in, do a quick few things, and then just that's it, right? The experience is targeted at small sessions, and often they're also filled with microtransactions. And then the more serious, quote unquote, mobile domain. And I think that one of the strengths of Apple Arcade in the mobile space is that it is definitely a more casual mobile experience, but it is at least trying to elevate that experience to a point where they aren't letting in games that'll ask you to buy something for real money every 20 minutes or whatever, right?
Right.
And you mentioned, did you say a friend or family member or something who had kids and was using
Yeah,
Apple
my
Arcade?
brother, yeah.
Yeah, your brother. And I think for that, the Apple Arcade service is also pretty good because you get all these games and you don't need to fear that the games are predatorily, is that even a word? Using predatory tactics to try and get money out of the kids or anything like that. So that's sort of off your mind with that.
That's important, I think, for sure, yeah.
Definitely. But yeah, in terms of myself, I am more in the serious, so to speak, or as you called it, mid-heavy category of games. Though I've grown up on consoles, so 30 frames per second and medium to low graphics isn't new to me, I guess.
Right. Yeah, I wanted to reach back and touch on a few points you both made, starting with Sam and the graphics thing. I'm in the same way. I believe the somewhat rough term is graphics whore. People may not appreciate that these days. I don't know. But I was definitely one of those. So I've been gaming for almost 30 years at this point. I'm 35, and I'm pretty sure I started when I was 5 or 6. And yeah, and of course, I mean, a lot of people are visual creatures anyway. Games are not. We're attracted to what we deem well attractive or pretty or interesting or colorful or whatever, or what even color scheme you like. There's like people who complain that Diablo 3 wasn't as dark and grim as Diablo 2 because the color scheme was a bit brighter, and to them that totally ruined the game for them. For example, some people are that particular. I thought Diablo 3 was great, but that's an aside. But is the game good or not? And I think that's really, really important to focus on more than this like nitpicky details. Like, is it running at 1440p, 60 FPS? I mean, well, frankly, a lot of Mac games won't run at that unless you've got a much higher end machine, like a higher end iMac or Mac Pro or something. Anything else you're probably looking at, like an indie game that could do that? I don't know. It's just, this goes back a little bit to that like general Mac gaming audience sort of lack of experience and knowledge and like what will really run. And I just see that constantly in, I'm not trying to throw Mr. MacRight's Discord under the bus, but he has a Discord and there's a bunch of people in it. And just all the questions are like, I don't know, I just was talking to this guy today. He's like, how do I get 100 FPS in Roblox on my MacBook? Was his question. There's a support channel and stuff, so people ask all these things, but it's kind of the same question all the time from different people. And I'm like, well, I didn't know, but someone else pointed out the game itself was apparently capped at 60 FPS, so some sort of engine limitation or something they just put in. But I was explaining to him, well, your hardware plus game configuration typically will determine your performance, and there's some advanced ways sometimes you can mess with that, like messing with any files, or if you're really crazy, like overclocking your hardware, that can be harmful if you don't know what you're doing, etc. And then it's also refresh rates of your screen. I think all the Macs are typically 60 hertz, or maybe some are 75. So it's like, even if you had 100 FPS, it wouldn't be benefiting you in any particular way. So that was just that. I actually kind of lost my train of thought why we were talking about, graphics and performance. And is the game good or not? And I noticed that too. And speaking of also Metro Exodus, because I first played it on actually GeForce Now earlier this year, and then they released a Mac version, which is a really tip-top port actually. Also runs on M1 machines quite well, actually. So if you're an M1 user of any kind, and you want a shooter or want to check out a sort of a shooter survival horror thing, go to like 100% get Metro Exodus. It's amazing. And yeah, Sam was talking about on like his Ultra PC, the new ray traced version, which is its own version of the game actually, because of how extensively they like added to it, versus maybe on a streaming platform or maybe even on your Mac, which can run it at higher Ultra if it's strong enough. Yeah, and it doesn't look as good, but the game's so good and immersive, it just pulls you in, and you do forget. And I've experienced this with other games, like can't really think of one right now, but same thing, first 20, 30 minutes maybe, or even less. And I'm like, I'm fiddling with the settings and trying to, how does it look on Ultra versus high versus medium or whatever. And then I just start playing, and sometimes I'll even forget I changed the settings. I'll go back later, I'm like, I left this on medium, and I didn't even notice. And I just played for hours and hours. And so I think that's the mark of what would be our consensus in terms of experiences. The game experience can trump the graphical one, which is also, why they keep making all these retro pixely 8-bit or 16-bit or whatever indie games, and some of them are just mega smash hits. I don't know, Super Meat Boy or something. It's probably more relevant. I don't know, Dead Cells, very pixelated game. I typically don't like pixelated games, not because I look down on them. It's just visually they don't appeal to me. But there's a few that really stand out. Dead Cells, I think, is terrific. What was it? What's it? Something Katana. Katana Zero? Zero Katana? I think it's Katana Zero. Really cool game as well. Also a pixel game. So I don't traditionally love them, but the difference is these are like, so you could call them visually seemingly casual games, but they actually have a very high skill cap. So they really fall into more like a medium heavy category. But as Casper was talking about, what's the target experience of the game? Is it meant to be for this short, like 10 or 15 minute play session, maybe on mobile games? Or is it more of like a long term, I don't know, sit down and play a shooter or RTS campaign or something, or multiplayer? So what's interesting to me is these kind of hybrid games like Hades, we mentioned earlier, Dead Cells, I think is a good example. They actually cater to both audiences. You can sit down and play it for 10 or 15 minutes, or you could sit down and play it for like 3 hours, or really try and min-max your performance in the game, or your run time, or your stats, or whatever. So that's also interesting. Let me switch the conversation a little bit. In terms of platforms, do you guys have any platform bias? And by platform, I mean Steam, Epic, App Store, could even be brand bias, NVIDIA, AMD, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's not 100% the same discussion, but it's a bit related. Like brand or platform loyalty, basically. Like, oh, I only game on Steam and nothing else, or only the App Store, though I don't think anyone would say that, but maybe they would. Or same thing. Oh, I only get just PC only, never touch anything else. Mac only, never touch anything else. This is kind of that hater thing I talked about earlier. And I think it goes on a little bit more, perhaps between like Xbox and PlayStation users. There's a lot of, but I think those platforms foster it because, well, especially from Sony, who puts out a lot of exclusives. Xbox seems to have largely stopped that. So, Casper, how do you feel about that kind of like platforms or brands? Where do you land there?
So one quick note on the Sony thing is that they've actually started releasing a bunch of their games, at least the older titles, on PC as well. Like Horizon Zero Dawn is available on PC now, and there's been talk of other titles coming to PC from Sony's catalog.
Right.
I think Ratchet and Clank and the Crash games, Crash Bandicoot. So they are at least opening that up a little with like more timed exclusive than complete exclusivity. Anyway, so I've played PlayStation a lot throughout my life, and I've also had Xboxes and obviously PC games and all that. So I've really traversed all the platforms, I guess. And I think it actually again comes down to is the game good phenomenon, that you don't really think so much about the platform you're playing on when you just have fun with the game.
Right.
And there are some advantages to certain platforms in terms of like, oh, my friends are on this platform, so I can play with them if I'm on the PlayStation Network or whatever. Or if you play a game on a PC or Mac, you might be able to multitask more easily. If you're playing Civilization, you might more easily quickly switch to a Discord chat or whatever, right? So, of course, every platform has its strength. But really, I don't necessarily think it matters all that much, to me at least.
Right.
What was I going to say? Oh, yeah, storefronts. So I mostly prefer sticking to Steam just because I think it's nice to have everything gathered in one place. So if I can get something on Steam, I'll usually do that. Plus, you get the crossplay thing. So if I boot into Windows, I can play it there. And if I'm in macOS and the game is available there, I can play it in macOS. If I buy it on the App Store, I don't get that. And it's more locked in. So if I eventually am on a Windows PC that can't boot into macOS, I wouldn't have the game there.
Right.
So because of that, I sort of prefer Steam. Also, you get the Steam chat, and you can talk to, or if you have friends connections there, you can do that, right? I don't really have anybody who would rely on Game Center, I think. I also do get things from the Epic Store just because sometimes they have free things, so you just take advantage of that, right?
Oh, yeah.
So that's, I guess, nice that you can get free games that way. And of course, they're good old games, which is nice for older titles if they're available there and nowhere else. And they typically come bundled with software that automatically runs the game in, like, if it's emulated or something, so to make that process easier.
Right.
So I guess I'm platform agnostic in that way. Though I do think I have a preference for playing with controllers. So I've always plugged controllers into my Mac when I play games where it feels appropriate. I wouldn't do it for Civilization, right? But yeah. So
makes sense. Yeah. Sam, how do you feel about all this?
Yeah. So platform wise, I have. Talking about storefronts and sort of the software platforms, definitely prefer Steam for the same reasons. I just like having everything in one spot, and I think Steam does a good job of those like extra little finishing touches, like cloud saves and cross save, and like just friends and discussions and the Steam Workshop and a lot of things that maybe don't seem like a big deal, but then when you go into a different storefront and none of them are there, you're just like, oh, I kind of like that feature. In regards to sort of the other platforms, I think I own every platform right now. And by every platform, I mean like current one. Like I have a PS5, a Series X, a Switch, a PC. Well, I had a Mac as of a month ago, and I sold it waiting for the new ones. But
yeah.
So I'm waiting for the M1X or M2 or whatever. So my biases have definitely changed over the years. I used to be the hardcore Mac fanboy, battling in the forums, whatever forum it may be with whoever, because you run into a lot of people who are like, oh well, a Mac costs some insane price, and then they pretend that a PC for like $100 would destroy it, and it's like, well, not really, but more recently, like as I've gotten older and like I'm married, I'm working a pretty decent job and stuff, I find the platform I like will change, but the main thing I'm looking for is just put me into the game, and I don't want to have to deal with anything other than just booting up this game. So consoles are good for that, and I actually find Macs pretty good for that too, because I don't have to like I have a really good PC, but like it's just little things like like Destiny 2, for example. I was playing that a couple months ago. The card I bought, it needed a driver fix that wasn't fixed for months, so I sold that card and bought a different card, and then it's just like I just want to play. I don't want to deal with that stuff.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, Windows can bug you with, I don't know, firewalls and updates and system updates, driver updates. Not that Mac has some of that, but it's much it's a lot less. It's also easier to turn off.
Yeah.
Usually anyway. So I feel you there for sure. Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. And I was curious about this in relation to the M1 and moving forward. Like, will there come a day where the M1 or future versions, M2, M3, whatever, like, will they be good enough or consistent enough where you could just say, almost console-like, like, here's a game available for Mac. If you have an M1 or M whatever, let's say if you have a Silicon machine, I guess you might have to specify, kind of like how we now have console versions of whatever, Xbox X and Series, blah, blah, I don't know them all, or a PS4 versus a PS5 or whatever. Like, if you have an M1, you could play this. Or, well, actually, this requires an M2 to play, or later, or something like that. I wonder if we could get the Mac platform or the Mac gaming experience like that straightforward. That would be very interesting if we could. And the introduction of the M1, which is now 8 months old, I think, so almost a year, 7 or 8 months old, something like that. It gave me a notion that might be possible. But of course, then we run into a different layer of, well, what are the expectations of running, right? Is it 1080p 30 FPS, 1080p 60 FPS, or 1440p or whatever? Of course, well, if you buy a little MacBook Air 13-inch screen, you're probably not going to have a giant resolution. But we're starting to get into like Silicon iMacs and stuff like that. So I guess that's maybe a question for you guys who have more console experience than I. Like, what's the expectation of a console's performance? Is it at all related to what kind of display you hook it up to, or how much you're blowing it up, or trying to play like 4K or not, or something like that? Like, does it just always run the same no matter what you plug it into, or is there some fluctuation in that? Not actually sure. Sorry, Sam.
So consoles, I like how this generation of consoles has pushed 60 a lot more. I don't think I'm a frame rate snob, but I do 30. I can play and I can handle 30. But as soon as I switch to a game that has 60 and switch back to the 30 game, it's like, whoa, this looks really like stuttery. If I play it for a couple hours, I get used to it. Destiny on consoles, which I played a lot of hours of, was 30 FPS. And then I remember I switched over to Call of Duty on the same console, and I was like, oh, Destiny looks like a slideshow compared to Call of Duty, because Call of Duty 60. So consoles will vary depending on the game and whatever the developers have chosen. Some choose 4K 30 FPS, other ones choose 60 and everything in between. So, but I would say my expectations for playable is just if it can run at 30 and 30 stable, not like 30, but really it's 26. If it's a consistent locked 30, then I would consider that playable. And if the M1 machines can do that, which a lot of them can, then I think you have a great gaming experience. Or maybe great's the wrong word, but you have a very playable gaming experience, and you can enjoy the game and get your money's worth.
Yeah, it's solid. It's solid. Yeah.
And then you had mentioned...
Casper? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, one more thought about League of Legends. You had mentioned how it doesn't... I'm not sure if it runs that well or not on the M1. Yeah, I know it doesn't run... The Mac port isn't great. And then so what League has done is they have... It's called League of Legends Wild Rift. It's a mobile game, but it's designed like from the ground up for the phone, like the Apple Silicon in the phone. And it's essentially the same game, just a little bit quicker, a little bit less complex, but more or less it's the same game. Actually looks the same graphically, maybe even a little bit better. That runs at 60 or even 120 FPS on an iPad or an iPhone. So like you could have companies start to... So like, the original League is this ancient game from like 2008. I'm guessing it's sort of beyond repairable from like a software and like optimization perspective. So they've basically scrapped all that, made Wild Rift, runs amazing on sort of the latest whatever. Casper, I'm sure, can speak more to the software side of things, but it just runs like amazing. And your iPhone's obviously silent. It's not like, whereas my 16-inch MacBook Pro, which is way more powerful, is just screaming when I'm playing League. So it's like, I think developers can get us to a point where some of those more modern titles take advantage of more modern stuff, and then we'll run really well on an M1.
Yeah, Casper, what are your thoughts here?
Well, I think that Sam touched on the most important point in my opinion, which is the consistency aspect. If a game runs consistently at 30 FPS, I don't mind it at all. If it fluctuates between just 25 and 30, it annoys me. And I'd honestly rather have a game that runs consistently at 30 than one that fluctuates between 45 and 60, even though those are higher frame rates. Because you notice it when it changes all the time on you. But you can ignore it if it's just stable all the time, right? And I think I played mostly on the prior generations of consoles, all the way back to the PS3 and Xbox 360. And most things there were 30 FPS. But most of it was also really stable. Whereas on the PC games I play and Mac games, I usually try and hit 60 rather than 30. But it's not really because I'm necessarily aiming for 60. It's just because I find it easier to make sure it's locked at 60 than consistently 30. Easier if games have a frame capping option where you can say just be 30, because then you don't go above either, and I would notice that jump upwards as well, right?
For sure.
So that's sort of my take on the will it run aspect, at least, I think.
Yeah.
It's fine if it runs consistently, whatever the resolution and graphics is, really. And you also mentioned something earlier, John, about the visuals of games. And I think that in a lot of cases, art style trumps fidelity, or how demanding the graphics are in terms of like realism and how well that's done, right? So if a game has appealing aesthetics, that matters. But whether or not the textures are rendered in high resolution, or if it does low res shadows or whatever, I don't think that's as important as how appealing the visuals are.
Yeah, I would agree too. And I've been, again, like run up against my own biases with, not that recently, but some years ago. I think mostly with some indie games. Sometimes I'm just like, this game's like ridiculously good looking. I mean, like the Trine series was well known for that. I don't think I'm going to pronounce this right, but Gris, Gris, the game, again, it was like this really artistic game, like visually, and the music and the audio. It won all kinds of awards and all kinds of stuff. I think the gameplay was on the lighter side, and again, it wasn't like some super high fidelity, ultra graphical game, but the combination of its presentation and art and style and music and stuff just really drew people in. The Banner Saga. 1, 2, and 3. I backed them all on Kickstarter back in the day. Another game, again, fairly like simple, but just the art is so rich and so well done and layered. It's just wow. And it's not even really that animated. Very little of it's actually animated. But it's just so well done. You're just like someone who, normally would prefer maybe some higher end, RPG, RTS shooter game or something. Is just like, I don't care because this is really drawing me in for what it's presenting. So yeah, the presentation definitely matters. And of course, beauty's in the eye of the beholder and all that. Some people might look at it anyway and just be like, man, not for me. But I think you can approach a level of close to universal appreciation. Like, okay, maybe that game isn't for me, but holy moly, does it look good? And I think some of these titles I just mentioned, or you guys may have some other examples, could hit upon that.
Cuphead
for
is
sure.
gorgeous. I don't think it's a game that interests me at all, but Cuphead is like everything's like a hand drawn, like artistic scene,
Right.
Like literally hand drawn. So, and then Borderlands, another really famous stylized,
Right.
game.
I wanted to
Style
mention Borderlands actually in relation to what you guys were just talking about on specifically Casper. Sorry, in the frame rate stuff. We already talked about who ported whatever last time, but Borderlands 3 actually has really good graphical options. Now, the Mac requirements are outrageous. I'm pretty sure I can confidently say it has the highest posted minimum requirements of any game in history, like bar none. It wants like an i9 processor, 16 gigs of RAM. This is minimum requirements, not recommended or something. And I think an 8 gigabyte graphics card for minimum requirements. I don't know of any PC game. Those are like high to ultra requirements on a lot of games. So the Mac port isn't like super well done in terms of optimization. You need kind of a beast machine to run it. Although I think the slightly better M1s can run it, at least close to stable 30. I think the 8-core 16 GB machine, I think, hits like 30 stable on it, or very close to it. Theoretically, my iMac can run it on ultra, I think they call it badass settings, but the frame rate fluctuates wildly. Some scenes it'll be 60 clean, and then others it'll just stutter all the way down to like low numbers. So that's an optimization thing, but graphics to the rescue. They have all sorts of nice frame rate caps, even a smooth, I think 22 to 60 or something weird thing. I'm not quite sure how that works. I've had to mess around even with like windowed mode or borderless windowed or full screen. Seems to have different effects. There's something weird going on with the Mac. This is a bit of a tangent. The Mac in windowed or full screen modes, in some games, I don't know if it's just an optimization things by the developers, just switching between the two can have like wildly different effects on performance. What do you think, Casper? Maybe you can comment on that.
So actually that's probably going to be a phenomenon on Windows as well in some games. Because the thing is that if you full screen a game, and this is both on Windows and Mac OS, the game can request to take full control of the display server while it's full screened, and directly manipulate the frame buffer. Whereas if it's running in windowed mode, it has to draw to a view that it then sends to the windowing system or display server system of the operating system for the operating system to then display. So there's a difference in the pipeline of how things get drawn on the display there, where if it's full screen, more of that is in the control of the game developer, or at least the game developer can choose to take control of that. They don't have to.
Very interesting. That makes sense. I didn't know that because I'm not technical enough, but I didn't also think about it too hard. I just noticed it. Borderlands 3, at least on my computer, is pretty guilty of this. Like, it'll wildly vary from just smooth, amazing performance to really wacky performance based on... In fact, what I found the best performance is, again, minor tangent, for Borderlands 3. I happen to have a really strong iMac from 2020, the best you can get, but almost the best. I don't know, like 120 gigs of RAM, but I have 64. Otherwise, it's maxed out. Actually running it at 4K or even 5K, but doing the screen render down to 50%. So it's actually doing it at like half. For whatever reason, that produces the best results and the most stable if I just go to 100% render and down to like 1080p, 1440p, it's not very happy. But I leave it at max res and just scale it down and do some shenanigans with the frame rate caps, it's like really happy and plays really well. So that's a bit of a curious case. We were talking about frame rate stability, and we have been talking about earlier, like, I was curious about the Steam Deck. I'm curious about what like Mac hardware can do, or even a PC. I think a lot of people, like gamers in general, if you're some sort of medium, if you're like into it, you're not just a casual person who has a whatever machine and you play whatever, who cares? I think there's this inherent curiosity of like, oh, what can my hardware do? How well can it play this game or this new game or even this old game? I've gone back and checked out particularly some Feral stuff like Sleeping Dogs and Shadow of Mordor, and playing it at like 4 or 5K, just for the heck of it, because I can, because these are games from like 5 or so years ago, or even longer in some cases. So that's been a bit of a fun exercise that I've played around with. But I think that about wraps it up, gents, unless you had some closing comments. What I'm mostly interested to see moving forward for Apple Silicon is, can we get to that space where it's like you have an M whatever chip, you can run the game like at this minimum level, like a stable 30, or maybe to eventually get to a stable 60 or something like that. That would be really cool. It'd also help the legion of, maybe not legion, it would help the Mac gamers out there who aren't as knowledgeable and are always asking questions. Can my machine run this? Can the machine run this? And you just say, do you have a Silicon whatever? You can run it, go. That would be nice.
And I think what makes that likely is that there's a lot fewer options here with the Apple Silicon than there are when we have Intel and AMD processors for CPU and GPU. Because if you're getting an M1, it doesn't matter if it's a Mac Mini, MacBook Air, a 13-inch MacBook Pro, or an iMac, they basically have the same configuration. There can be minor tweaks in how much RAM you have, if you have the 7 or 8 core GPU and a bit of thermal headroom, but it's more or less the same. That's a lot of Macs that's covered under like sort of one configuration. Whereas the space right now, even just looking at, even just looking at the 21.5-inch iMac, you had configurations that just had Intel integrated graphics. You had configuration with a Radeon 555, 560, I think, and various different Intel GPUs varying from a super low powered one to a more reasonable desktop CPU. Just a lot of configurations there, right? Mm-hmm. And with the M1, that's all been simplified into just one thing. And I think we're probably not going to have more than 2, 3, maybe 4 different configurations per generation of M series chips. So that really could simplify that. And it could also lead to more opportunities for optimization. Because if anybody has been playing older consoles like the PlayStation 3, if you look at just the raw hardware in those machines, it was very weak relative to the end of the generation PCs you could get. But still, there were games like The Last of Us, which relative to the hardware it was running on looked fantastic on the PlayStation, right? But that was all due to a known specification of optimization against, right? We knew what processors were in the PlayStation and could optimize for that specifically. But when you have a PC space where even just within the Mac, where there's still limited scope of configurations relative to PC, there's so many different targets to cover that you can't hyper optimize like you can if you just have a smaller scope and simplified configuration options.
Yeah, and just to add to that, once the M1 and then down the road the M2 or M3, whatever, like once they have basically a few years of those chips marinating on the market, I was trying to bring up the numbers, but I couldn't find the ones I was looking for. But basically, prior to Apple Silicon, the vast majority of Macs sold, I believe, was over 75%, probably close to 85 or 90%, were basically Macs that can't really game. And by the not game, I mean like they have like a really low end integrated Intel card, and you could play maybe a couple indie titles, but that's it. You're not playing really anything beyond like a light indie game. So that means really developers prior to this, from like 2006 when Intel transition came out all the way to 2019, they're basically only making games for Mac gamers who own a 15-inch MacBook Pro, a 27-inch iMac, or a Mac Pro, or some very fringe cases where like it was a 13-inch maybe that had a good chip, which there was a couple over the years, but not many. So you're basically only coding for like 15-20% of Mac people, and then obviously of those people, not all of them are gamers, so it's a very tiny market. Now you're going to have these chips that, like Casper was saying, you can optimize really well for, and they're also chips that everyone just has. So people don't have to think about it. They can see your game in the App Store or on Steam, and they can just go, "That looks interesting, I'm going to buy that," and they don't have to necessarily worry about it not running. Period. Like the previous Intel MacBook Air with the HD 615 graphics, I think. If you try to run like Borderlands 3 or Shadow of the Tomb Raider, you're probably getting like literally like 2 FPS. And you'd be really upset with your purchase because it's not playable in any way. So yeah, it'll be nice. Just millions of people will have this option to play games on Mac, and then I'll hopefully need more games.
Yeah, absolutely. Similarly, like we ended last time, I think it's headed in the right direction for sure, for all the reasons both you guys just said. The baseline saturation, machines will be more playable, more stable, optimizing just for more or less one system or a few minor variants, like Casper was saying, rather than a whole whatever Pandora's box of them. That's really cool. I think I'm seeing it with this is where I'm curious, is how much overlap, or whatever you want to call it, bleed over, maybe that's the wrong word, will we get of, because Switch runs on ARM, doesn't it, or ARM, right? And so does now the M1s and the Silicons. So Switch has games like Witcher 3 and Doom Eternal. How easy or not would it be to like port those over to either A, run on an iPad, or B, like an M1 type machine? I don't know, but I'm curious if developers will start looking at it that way or not. I don't know.
I think it's gonna be
pretty hot right now.
Yeah, it's gonna be harder to port something from the Switch to the Mac than it is going from Windows to the Mac, even when both the Switch and the Mac are on ARM processors. Mostly because the tool chain is already in order for Windows ports from Feral and Aspire and places that already have the tool chain. But also, the most important thing I think I mentioned last time as well, isn't the CPU architecture, but it's the rest of the software stack.
Right.
So even if they speak the same instruction stream or instruction set, something like what happens when you make a system call to whatever specific system call you're trying to do, that's going to vary from the Mac to the Switch. And when you try to call the operating system's window manager to get a window for it or something, that's going to be different. And all these things matter somewhat more than just the CPU architecture, at least if you're coding in a higher level language, which everyone is these days.
Yeah, of course. That makes sense. Yeah. In any case, it's all promising once again in the direction we're going. There's all kinds of stuff we want to cover in future episodes, and something we only touched upon briefly here was like cloud gaming. That's more or less worth its own main topic for both history of it and use of it and this and that, or again, the experience of it. Is it worth it? How will it, is there any notable impact on PC or Mac gamers or developers and all this stuff? But that's something we'll get into another time. But that's something we touched upon very briefly earlier when we were talking about stuff we've used, or Sam was talking about how he played, Metro Exodus or whatever on streaming for a while. That's something I want to get into next time. Maybe not episode 3, perhaps on episode 4. Yeah, Casper.
But just a tiny addendum to what I said before about the ease of porting. So even though it's probably going to be easier to port from the Windows version or something like that, one advantage you might actually have if you already have a Switch version or something is that optimizations that specifically target that architecture might carry over. So you might not be able to port it directly from just the Switch version, but if you've done some coding tricks that are specifically targeting ARM or perhaps tile-based rendering GPUs rather than immediate mode ones or something like that, that could carry over.
That makes sense. Yeah, I'm very interested to see, probably more looking at 2022 than anything, I don't expect too much necessarily the rest of this year, other than hopefully more Apple Silicon stuff in the fall, and but perhaps 2022 will see it take off. Sam, any final thoughts here?
Yeah, one final thought I had. I was talking about this with somebody at the IMG forums earlier this week. Is just to make sure listeners keep in mind that like just the gaming market in general it moves slowly. Just because the M1's great and it can run most games probably at least playable, it doesn't mean devs overnight are rushing to port their games. It takes sometimes years to get those games over. So I would expect a couple of years before we hopefully are hitting like massive, like long strides. And hopefully in the meantime, we start getting just a slow sort of almost snowball of a few more games here, a few more games there. And then all of a sudden, I think in a few years, we'll see quite a few games.
That makes sense. I like that. Yeah, perspective's important, and looking to the future and the trends or the expectations or the intent of developers and so on and so forth. Absolutely important. So thank you very much, gents. That'll wrap up our episode 2 here. And thanks everyone for listening, and we will catch you next time.
Take care, guys.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on the web at www.macgamecast.com.